here to hopefully help you as we do our final push to get ready for the concert with the end of Metroplex, measure 61 to the end. And what I'm going to be addressing are some things that a lot of the woodwind folk have said are some issues. So some of this may apply to you, some of it may not, but hopefully everything will be helpful here for you looking at this rather difficult spot. So some of the first things people have said are where we have longer sections of 16th notes, people seem to get lost. And sometimes I think it's because they're not sure where they are in the measure. And some of that it can be solved simply by drawing in where each beat is. And so if that's the case for you, if you get lost and you're not sure where you're at in the measure, remember that when we have these 16th notes throughout here, the 16th notes are grouped by beat, right? We have 4 16th notes in a beat, so it can be as simple as drawing a slash through the beginning of each beat. So if I'm in 3/4, here's my first beat, here's my second beat, here's my third beat, and then here's beat 1 of the next measure, right? And we can do the same thing down here. Beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 1, so forth. If we're talking 4/4, here's beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4. You get the idea. Doesn't work everywhere, right? Here's the 5/4 bar, and here we have some rests. Beat 1, beat 2 would fall here where the 8th rest is, and then here's beat 3, beat 4, and then beat 5 starts in the C sharp. So if you feel like you're getting lost because you're not sure where you're at in those longer runs of 16th notes, that's one way to solve that problem, by drawing in where each beat begins and kind of knowing where that is. You can number the beats too. You can put a 1, 2, 3, and so forth on top of it. Some other folks have talked about struggling with some of the chromatic things. And in a couple spots here, we do have some chromatics that go pretty long. They go above a range of an octave. For you guys, thankfully, you only have one that does that, and it's at the very end here. Most of the chromatic scales that we do in warm-ups only go an octave up and down. And for you guys, it's a B-flat chromatic scale. And here at the end, you have that B-flat chromatic scale. It's just extended a little bit. So if you notice here, you have that scale. It starts here, and it ends here. So practice that B-flat chromatic scale. Get it really comfortable at the speed that you know you need it to go. Then see if you can tack on these last 2 notes, your E sharp, which is really an F natural, and your F sharp, and then work that in. Everything else chromatic-wise here you have that B-flat chromatic scale, and then you're going to do it again. Here we have part of that chromatic scale, and we kind of dip down, and then we dip back up. So it's kind of knowing a chunk of that scale and being able to turn it back around and go back up. But again, that B-flat chromatic scale is going to be your friend, and knowing how to manipulate part of it or being able to expand on that B-flat chromatic scale. Something else is pattern work, right? Practice smarter, not harder. Look at stuff that's repeated throughout your music, right? We know this segment here comes back right away here. We know it comes back later on for you in the piece. Again, right here. My challenge to you would be to get that really strong and get that comfortable, but then also practice what comes on either side of it, right? Because it's practicing that, but then also practicing the transitions into and out of that. That's the different material that you need to get comfortable on either side of that performance of the things that are the same. So getting that stuff and knowing where it repeats is great, but chances are on either side of that repeated material is different stuff. So you need to know how to get into and out of it. The last piece of advice that I'll give you, or the last piece that I'll give you is this. If you're still struggling with being able to get all of these notes in your fingers, and there are a lot of notes, you'll notice throughout here that I have some extra stems and some extra beams here. And what I have done what I'm doing here is showing you how for some of this you can play 8th notes instead of 16th notes, right? So 8th notes are embedded in 16th notes, and what you can do is simply play the first and third of every group of 4/16 notes, and now you're playing eighth notes. So we'd skip the second and fourth notes. So if you look through some of these passages where I have those extra stems and those extra beams, those extra stems and beams would be the notes that you would play to play eighth notes instead of 16th notes. Up here it's a little bit funky to look at it in the 7/8, but here in the group of 6 eighth notes you played the first, the third, and the fifth, and then you omit the other ones. If you really feel like you're not going to get all of these notes into your fingers, along with this video I'll post a simplified part that has some of your runs broken down as eighth notes instead of 16th notes. It will be a little bit harder for you to put together if you've been trying and working on these 16th notes, but it is there for you to try. I do want you to feel like you're playing this song in the concert. I do want you to feel like you are contributing. That's important to me. But if you want to give that a shot, go for it. What I am going to do now, and the bulk of the rest of this video, is going to be a playback, a play-along section here. And I'm going to give you 6 different tempos for you to be able to kind of get your horn ready and play along with, so you can work out anything you need to. There will be a metronome click, so you can keep track of things, and it will click through the multi-measure rests here. But hopefully these different tempos will allow you to play along, work through any fingers or rhythms that are still a little rough or rusty for you, and help you really push through and get this as clean as you can possibly make it for the concert. Okay, so we're going to start really slow and work up to close to concert tempo. So here we go. 6 different tempo for you to play along with. Use this to your advantage. And here's our first tempo. I'm going to go a little faster this time. And let's go a little faster. and a little faster. And a little faster. And finally, let's go what we want to be performance tempo. Okay, so hopefully this gave you, if nothing else, then something to practice along with as we get this final push to help you guys play to the best of your ability as we have our concert coming up in about a little under 2 weeks. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to ask in rehearsal or track me down or on Schoology. But thanks, and let's push forward and have a great, strong concert. All right.